At 0415 hours, a hostile Russian mechanized column pushed into a narrow transit lane that appeared completely clear. Buttoned up inside T-90M tanks and BMP-3 vehicles, hostile crews scanned their sectors through thermal optics, confident in heavy armor and active electronic warfare suites. They maintained tight tactical intervals, keeping strict distance between hulls, comms silent, jammers running hot. To any observer, they looked fully in control. For those crews, this seemed like a routine push toward the objective. But they were rolling blind into a pre-registered kill zone set days ago. What followed over those next critical minutes was not a traditional engagement, but a brutal demonstration of how modern defensive assets can systematically dissect a heavy mechanized thrust until absolutely nothing moves. The enemy mechanized column that entered this corridor was organized around a classic, doctrine-approved armored assault structure. We must analyze this specific unit structure to understand exactly why their entire operation fell apart. Leading the spearhead were T-90M main battle tanks, representing the pinnacle of active Russian heavy armor. Their mission: clear the path, identify threat vectors, and suppress defensive positions on contact. Behind the armor rolled BMP-3 fighting vehicles carrying mechanized infantry. These platforms are engineered to advance alongside heavy tanks, shield troops from shrapnel and small arms fire, and rapidly dismount infantry once they reach the designated objective. Embedded in the column were critical logistics assets carrying fuel and ammunition, both heavily consumed in high-intensity operations. Because without constant resupply, even frontline armor is neutralized in a matter of hours. Furthermore, specialized electronic warfare units were integrated to disrupt drone feeds and blind local air defenses. Their goal was to sever communications and completely deny us aerial observation of their column. Make no mistake, this tactical formation was not thrown together overnight, but built on decades of established mechanized doctrine, formulated during the Cold War, and continually refined in recent regional conflicts. The core principle of this doctrine dictates that armor, infantry, artillery, and electronic warfare must operate as one fully integrated system, not isolated elements. An isolated tank is easy prey for anti-tank teams, lone infantry gets shredded by artillery, and big guns cannot hold ground on their own. In unison, tanks deliver direct fire lethality and heavy shielding, infantry clear the flanks and eliminate close-range threats, artillery hammers the deep battle space, and electronic warfare blinds the defender's communications. Success therefore hinges on constant tactical communication, and crucially, momentum. A moving target is significantly harder to destroy than a static one, allowing the attacker to maintain the initiative and pressure our defensive lines. In historical theaters of operation, like past campaigns in the Middle East or earlier phases of this conflict, rapid armor thrust succeeded because defenders lacked persistent aerial surveillance and responsive counter-battery fire. High-speed columns could traverse fatal funnels rapidly, rupturing defensive lines and forcing a retreat before the enemy could mount a coordinated counterattack. Hence, armored doctrine prioritizes momentum, which paralyzes defensive decision cycles and denies the defender time to react. The moment a column stalls or halts, or loses cohesion, targeting becomes incredibly easy. That is why commanders push their crews to advance even under heavy incoming fire. But in this engagement, the hostile force was not deploying across open plains where they could disperse and maneuver freely. Instead, they channeled themselves into a restrictive, narrow corridor, forced into a vulnerable single-file column. Inside this bottleneck, heavy tanks cannot pivot, troop carriers cannot bypass obstacles off-road, and each platform's survival depends entirely on the lead vehicle keeping up the pace. If a single vehicle stalls, the entire trailing element instantly grinds to a halt. Unable to reverse or disperse off-road, the trailing vehicles quickly bunch up, compressing the formation into a tight, high-density line of targets with zero room to maneuver. This restrictive terrain completely strips the attacker of their greatest tactical advantage, which is maneuver. Once maneuver is denied, even state-of-the-art armor becomes sitting ducks, unable to reposition, evade incoming strikes, or disperse to minimize combat losses. On external surveillance, the armor column entered the choke point looking tight and fully operational. Comms were green, electronic warfare suites were humming, and assets remained intact. But that terrain had already sealed their fate before the crews even realized it. This heavy formation was built to sweep across open plains, not to squeeze through a lethal corridor where one wrong move traps the entire line with zero margin for error. In a bottleneck, an assault force becomes a literal chain. Every vehicle is a vital link, and if just one breaks, the whole column grinds to a halt. The defenders knew this exact vulnerability, and instead of engaging the entire heavy column head-on, they executed a simpler, far more brutal strategy. They did not need to obliterate every single vehicle immediately, nor did they have to trade direct fire with heavy armor. Their primary objective was to strip away mobility. Once that column froze, the rest of the kill was easy. As we study this engagement, we must understand that defenders did not try to instantly vaporize this armor column because their immediate command directive was to kill their movement, not destroy the metal. In modern combat, speed beats armor plating every day. A moving target is hard to lock, hard to track, and nearly impossible to encircle. But a static vehicle is just a ticking clock before it gets pinned and destroyed. That is why modern anti-tank doctrines emphasize mission kill, first freeze them in their tracks, then execute the final strike. This setup keeps our defenders safe while maximizing the lethality of incoming artillery and drones. To freeze the line, defenders targeted precision choke points instead of the entire unit, knowing that halting just one or two vehicles in a bottleneck traps dozens behind them. Mines were seeded across key lanes, while terrain features, like tight roads, water canals, or deep mud, completely denied tanks and fighting vehicles any room to bypass the main road. Once the point vehicle was blown, the column had zero room to bypass. Then, as artillery and mines sealed the rear, any hope of retreat was entirely cut off. This left the entire armor element boxed in, trapped between a dead front and a burning rear. The moment that trap snapped shut, the formation lost its single greatest asset: tactical mobility. At this stage, those armored assets remained deadly, and fully armed heavy guns were online. Infantry had ammo, and electronic jamming suites were still blasting signal noise. But all that firepower meant nothing, because the unit was completely pinned, unable to advance or withdraw. For mechanized infantry, movement is life. It lets you displace, dodge incoming shells, and coordinate flanking maneuvers. But strip that movement, and those multi-million-dollar war machines are just massive targets waiting for long-range strikes. An immobilized tank is a sitting duck for artillery, loitering munitions, and anti-tank missiles. When multiple tracks pile up in a tight zone, they stop being a fighting force and become a massive target cluster. The psychological pressure on these trapped crews and their commanders is immense, knowing that sitting still under active enemy surveillance is a death sentence, yet having absolutely zero safe vectors for escape. With their front blocked and the rear taking heavy fire, turning back is out of the question, and veering off-road guarantees hitting minefields or bogging down in deep mud. As the pileup grows, the column compacts into bumper-to-bumper spacing. This spikes the risk that a single catastrophic explosion or secondary fire chain reacts through multiple vehicles. A proud mechanized assault force is reduced to a sitting duck convoy with absolutely no room to maneuver or escape. This brutal tactical playbook highlights a massive shift in modern combat doctrine, where historical battles relied on direct, overwhelming firepower. But today's operations follow a much more calculated sequence. Step 1. Locate the target using recon drones and advanced sensor arrays. Step 2. Track their telemetry, so command knows exactly where they are heading. Step 3. Strike the key transit nodes to completely immobilize the formation. Step 4. Once they are stranded and unable to support each other, cut them into isolated pockets. Only then, as you and I watch, does the final phase begin the systematic, cold-blooded destruction of every single target. In this tactical sequence, raw destruction isn't our first move, it is the final blow. By the time we start pulling the trigger, the outcome is decided. The enemy has already lost mobility, command coordination, and critical situational awareness. By freezing the enemy column rather than striking immediately, frontline units drastically reduce their own risk, amplifying the lethality of every weapon deployed next. Heavy artillery is far more lethal against static targets. Hunter-killer drones exploit motionless vehicles easily, and the enemy chain of command shatters when isolated units can no longer reposition or support each other. Locking them in place acts as a force multiplier, maximizing the lethality of our assets without burning extra ammo. Once the armor was pinned and trapped inside the kill zone, our units did not rush into a head-on fight. They knew that time was firmly on their side, and that the trapped convoy grew weaker by the minute. Bypassing a single massive strike, they initiated a calculated, systematic dismantling of the entire hostile column, slicing from front to rear and center to the flanks. If we look closely, there are no random strikes here. Our operators systematically dismantle the convoy with cold, clinical precision, because shattering a mechanized unit structure first makes total destruction significantly easier. The vanguard was dead in its tracks, and the rear was completely blocked. Logically, the next targets were the specific assets, keeping the convoy functioning as a unified combat system. We targeted supply trucks packed with fuel and ammunition, tactical command rigs, coordinating communications, and tightly packed centerline targets where a single strike could trigger cascading collateral damage. By eliminating these high-value targets, our teams weren't just wrecking metal, they were severing the enemy's nervous system. Logistics assets are high-priority targets. Without continuous fuel and ammo replenishment, heavy armor is completely useless. When those supply trucks explode, frontline combat assets suffer immediate, catastrophic fallout. When ammo carriers take hits, violent secondary detonations tear through the ranks as shells cook off. Nearby vehicles get shredded by shrapnel, while burning fuel tankers unleash infernos of black, choking smoke, blinding the crews and raising internal temperatures of adjacent armor to unbearable levels. This thick, rising plume serves as a massive beacon, making the trapped column an effortless target for our aerial surveillance. Furthermore, taking out command vehicles and comms gear completely breaks down overall operational cohesion. Cut off from orders and intelligence, even elite hostile units degenerate into disorganized targets, unable to coordinate a retreat or push forward. Artillery and drones coordinate seamlessly during this phase. This lethal synergy is exactly how we are tearing their armor apart. Overhead assets stream real-time targeting telemetry directly to our batteries, mapping every vehicle's exact position. While our drones track damage and breakout attempts, heavy guns rain down highly precise, drone-corrected fire. As each round impacts, drone operators immediately feed back adjustments, ensuring the next strike is dead on. This feeds a brutal, continuous cycle of target acquisition and strike. Our drones act as the eyes, and heavy artillery serves as the hammer. Thanks to this doctrine, our frontline infantry and armor don't have to risk direct exposure to hit the column. We can systematically erase hostile assets from maximum standoff range, keeping our troops secure. If you and I analyze this, it is a massive evolution from legacy warfare, where batteries fired blind barrages over vast areas. On today's battlefield, artillery guided by drones and digital data links makes every single shell count, striking high-value targets instead of empty dirt. Rather than wasting fire, our gunners selectively prioritize which targets to eliminate now and which to save for later. This allows us to systematically dismantle their entire formation piece by piece. By crushing supply lines and targeting command assets, we trigger secondary explosions, mass panic, and complete tactical paralysis across the remaining hostile armor. These compounding battlefield factors strip the trapped tactical units of any ability to mount a coordinated defense. With multiple hulls burning, the kill zone inside the corridor became a chaotic, blistering inferno as temperatures surged. Thick black smoke choked out visibility, and wrecked hulls completely blocked any egress. Trapped tank crews looked out to see burning hulls ahead and shattered armor behind them. They knew staying stationary under the constant gaze of hostile eyes was a death sentence. But shifting position was impossible. The path was completely choked, and the off-road terrain was far too dangerous to risk. This nightmare inflicted severe physical and immense psychological terror on crews trapped inside multi-million-dollar armor built for speed, but now completely immobilized. By this hour, the offensive column was no longer an organized strike package. It had dissolved into isolated, dying targets, some burning, some shattered, and all tracked in real time by hostile surveillance drones hovering directly overhead. The defenders had no reason to rush. Time was firmly on their side, as every passing minute left the trapped formation more degraded, panicked, and ripe for destruction. This was no longer a lightning-fast armored assault, but a methodical, brutal turkey shoot, systematically erasing every single vehicle from the active order of battle. Yet, heavy artillery and standard rotary drones weren't the primary executioners here. The weapon doing the absolute most damage to these trapped tanks was actually much smaller, far cheaper, and virtually immune to standard electronic jamming assets. A key reason this armored column couldn't break the trap was the absolute failure of tactical electronic warfare against incoming fiber-optic drones, as most of these main battle tanks carried jammers tuned strictly for radio frequencies. But those active defense systems were useless against weapons guided by physical micro-thin cables. Ordinarily, electronic warfare easily neutralizes standard radio-controlled threats by severing the vital signal link to the remote pilot. Once that telemetry link drops, the threat typically falls out of the sky. For a decade, modern militaries assumed high-powered jammers would insulate heavy armor from aerial drone strikes, and that doctrine held up as long as the target drone relied on vulnerable radio frequencies. But now, fiber-optic platforms have rewritten the rules. They bypass airwaves entirely, tethered directly to the pilot by a micro-thin wire that feeds instant video and flight commands without interruption. This hardwired architecture makes these systems nearly impossible to disrupt with standard military jamming gear. The UAV deploys a spool of micro-thin cable, unreeling it mid-flight to maintain a continuous, unjammable physical data link straight back to the pilot. Since telemetry feeds through glass instead of the air, conventional electronic warfare cannot touch or degrade the command stream. This guarantees the operator full tactical control even inside environments with maximum electronic warfare saturation. They can hover slowly, pivot on a dime, stalk a target, and punch directly into weak points like turret roofs, vulnerable engine decks, or open hatches. With a constant high-definition video feed, the pilot can steer the weapon with pinpoint precision even through thick smoke, fires, or heavy dust. This creates a deadly dynamic in narrow choke points. Immobilized armor columns are sitting ducks for slow, high-precision loitering munitions that can take their time selecting the perfect point of impact. On open ground, combat vehicles can maneuver, exploit defile positions, or outrun incoming aerial threats. But trapped inside a blocked corridor with zero room to maneuver, their tactical options drop to zero. The operator can coast in, inspect the target leisurely from above, and execute a vertical dive into vulnerable top armor. Top-down protection on tanks and infantry fighting vehicles is notoriously thin, since modern armor is engineered to defeat direct frontal kinetic threats, not vertical attacks from above. This critical design vulnerability is now being exploited by high-angle drone strikes. The math is brutal. These mass-produced fiber-optic drones cost a tiny fraction of a modern battle tank. And yet, they are capable of totally destroying multi-million-dollar combat systems. This asymmetric reality allows dirt-cheap weapons to systematically erase high-value strategic assets. In modern combat, this asymmetric cost ratio is devastating. Losing a main battle tank is not just about the metal it wipes out elite crews, heavy munitions, and vital tactical capability. When cheap, small drones take out multiple armored platforms, the enemy secures an incredible tactical return on their tiny investment. As more fiber-optic drones flooded the kill zone, stranded and disabled armor became easy prey. Immobilized targets were completely defenseless, as operators systematically selected and dismantled them one by one. Forget the classic tank duel of two armored divisions trading blows. When we analyze the telemetry, it looks less like a battle and more like a slow dismantling process. Every strike bled their active combat power, stripping away heavy firepower and crushing the morale of surviving crews. Tactical comms collapsed entirely, cohesion shattered, and units trapped inside the bottleneck devolved into desperate, isolated targets rather than a unified assault force. By this point, the mechanized vanguard was no longer a functioning unit. Each crew was fighting their own private battle for survival amidst catastrophic damage. Several hulls burned, others sat crippled and blind, while terrified crews waited in total radio silence for orders that would never come. The force that rolled into the valley as an elite spearhead was now just a collection of sitting ducks, tracked and targeted from the sky. With hulls cooking off all around them, a secondary, silent crisis erupted inside the armor. This nightmare forced the tankers to make the most lethal decision of their lives. As the narrow choke point filled with burning wreckage, the internal environment of those vehicles deteriorated rapidly. The primary threat wasn't even incoming hostile fire anymore. It was the toxic, suffocating air inside their own hatches. When an armored hull is struck or nearby wreckage ignites, internal temperatures skyrocket in seconds because these heavily armored compartments suffer from extremely restricted ventilation. Acrid smoke from the exterior fires pours through breached armor and open hatches. Once that smoke breaches the cabin, it blinds the operators and chokes out their remaining oxygen. Onboard electronics start failing as extreme heat fries critical circuitry, cutting off command radios and shorting out targeting optics, effectively severing any link to the rest of the unit. Worse, onboard tank shells and propellant become unstable in the heat, risking a catastrophic internal ammunition cook-off that instantly vaporizes the crew. In this hellscape, staying inside is a death sentence. Armor is only an asset if the hull is functional and the crew can actually breathe. Internal fire suppression systems are built to handle minor electrical sparks, not the raging external infernos radiating from a dozen destroyed tanks. With multiple wrecks ablaze in a tight sector, ambient heat surges, driving internal temperatures up to unsurvivable extremes. Crews face a grim ultimatum: roast inside a crippled metal tomb, or bail out into a lethal crossfire. It is the ultimate combat dilemma, with both options carrying an incredibly high risk of death. Bailing out is technically a tactical dismount, a maneuver mechanized infantry drill for constantly in training. But evacuating inside an active kill zone is a far cry from a controlled tactical deployment. As we know, inside that hull, troops are shielded from shrapnel, small arms, and blast waves. The platform provides critical comms, networks, night vision sights, and heavy mobile fire support. Once you hit the dirt, those tactical advantages vanish, leaving you totally exposed to the elements. With enemy reconnaissance drones loitering overhead, feeding live targeting data directly to hostile artillery units, exposed infantry are infinitely easier to acquire than vehicles, especially through thermal optics, which paint human body heat as bright, unmistakable beacons in the dark. By 4:45 a.m., the tactical reality was clear. The implications went far beyond destroyed armor. What disintegrated in that choke point was not just a Russian vanguard, but the archaic doctrine that sheer mass, heavy armor, and electronic jamming can guarantee supremacy on a modern, transparent battlefield. Those classic advantages became fatal liabilities. Once momentum stopped, every high-value asset was easily tracked, isolated, and systematically eliminated. That is the brutal lesson of this front. Modern combat rewards whoever spots first, jams first, and drops precision fire. Firepower is dead weight without intelligence, lightning speed, and absolute coordination. And once an armored column gets pinned in a tight kill zone, even heavy tanks become steel coffins. For more raw, frontline intel and direct combat updates from these active zones, subscribe to Military Force. Stand by for our next sitrep.